And now I'd like to invite our third speaker, Rory Downham, to speak to us today. So Rory has been committed to capacity building in the humanitarian sector for over 25 years. He holds an MSc in adult learning and has specialised in developing learning and development programs specific to the needs of the sector. Rory is currently the Director of Learning and Development at Bioforce, a French NGO specialising in capacity building in the aid sector. And Rory led Bioforce's State of the Humanitarian Profession study, which was published in December 2020. So I invite Rory to speak to us now. He will be discussing the issue of incorporating localisation in humanitarian HR culture. So thanks very much, Rory.
Thank you, Melanie, and it's great to be here, and great to be part of this very important conversation. The title of my short presentation is "Incorporating Localization in Humanitarian HR Culture: Recommendations from the 8th SOHP Study." And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a part of the results of this study, which I'll introduce first, which focused on recruitment tendencies and came up with a few interesting conclusions around HR practice. It's slightly provocative, but the issue at hand, and which came up in our study, was that there seems to be quite a distinctive inconsistency between the general adhesion to the localization agenda and HR practices, which do not seem necessarily to systematically be favor localization. And as I think most people know, localization is often broken down into several dimensions, like funding, capacity enhancement, partnerships, etc., etc. But localization should also include human resources policies for international aid organizations and the localization of human resources that are deployed in responses. But basically, human resources should be as local as possible and as international as necessary. And yet we still seem to have very often a human resources culture, which often makes it difficult for local actors to access leading roles. And that's the general conclusion and issue that came out of our study. And I just like to go through some of the findings that support that conclusion, and then I'll finish with some recommendations that the study came up with to make human resources practice more consistent with localization. A few words about the study. So the study was carried out in 2019 and 2020. A focus on the professionalization of the humanitarian workforce, and based on the assumption that the quality of humanitarian aid depends largely on the level of professionalization of that workforce. The study was aimed at individuals involved in humanitarian work, the organizations that employ them, and organizations who support humanitarians through training, delivery, etc., in order to inform their curricula. As far as methodology was concerned, quite an extensive consultation. I won't go through all the details, you have them here, and which finished in a conference that brought together over 500 people last November, and which chewed through some of the results and findings to come up with some recommendations. This produced a report, which I'll provide the link at the end, which is available in English and in French, and is public, and looking at various aspects of the professionalization of the humanitarian workforce, including identifying 24 humanitarian profession areas, a snapshot on each of them, and then tendencies across all profession areas as far as professionalization is concerned, but also things like recruitment. So to focus on what the study found around recruitment, one of the interesting findings was that there is a clear tendency to prefer experience, so the numbers of years of experience in humanitarian profession as a criterion for recruitment over proven competencies. And so I'm not saying that this is what all humanitarian organizations do, but this is what came out of our findings over an extensive consultation. And what that means, and the effect that has is that it's very, very difficult for new talent to access these positions. And there is a tendency to recruit people with experience, so people who are already in the sector, and making it very, very difficult for new talent, for juniors to come into the sector, and that's in particular for nationals. And another finding was that in the vocabulary and in the way staffing is often structured, for international organizations, human resources is generally structured around a division between national and international staff. So it's not a focus on competencies, it's a focus on the status. A number of things that the study seemed to indicate, for example, the respondents clearly identify that there are more and more initiatives towards the localization of recruitment, localization of staffing, replacing international regional roles with national contracts, etc., etc. However, that this change is often driven more by cost and access than by a commitment to the localization agenda. And that generally speaking, international humanitarian organizations are still very slow to nationalize roles, and that certain types of function seem systematically reserved, certain roles seem systematically reserved for international staff. And during the conference, this was an interesting reflection that I wanted to share with you. There was an interesting conversation around the fact that during the COVID-19 pandemic, this has caused a shift in the intervention models, often where international staff have had to relocate or return home or work remotely, and yet the humanitarian activity hasn't come to a grinding halt just because of a reduced presence of international staff. So what does that mean about the relevance of very often creating and recruiting to international positions as opposed to localizing them? This brought up a series of questions, and just after this, I'll provide some of the suggestions around these questions. But they're interesting questions which need tackling. One is, is there a set of skills or knowledge that international roles require that are not present in national roles? Because if there isn't, what's the justification for having specific international roles? Does humanitarian work require a cadre of international staff to be present, or can they share knowledge and advice from a distance? And what have we learned from the COVID pandemic about that? Is international presence, physical presence, absolutely necessary? What are the reasons that make humanitarian organizations reluctant to pass responsibility to national staff? And one of the reasons we'll see later is this aversion to risk, which we need to overcome. And to what extent are these reasons linked to the question of competencies, or rather things like aversion to risk? So by identifying these questions and then tackling them, I think it helps us better understand ways of improving the way we go around human resources practices in relation to localization. So in a nutshell, and this comes back to the issue from the beginning, yes, localization is frequently extolled. It's very much high up on the agenda of conversations today, and a lot of international organizations have signed up to the localization agenda. However, for those international organizations, staffing is still often built around this system of international and national roles. And so the question is this system making it hard for national staff to enter, to progress? And furthermore, does it encourage talent to leave their own country for greater recognition as expats and no longer become national, local or national resources? And the study we did showed that, as I already said, the pandemic has caused many international staff to leave the field, raising questions about the very value of their presence and role initially. So what exactly are the competencies that international candidates have that national applicants don't? We need to be able to answer that question. And if we're not clear about that, then it's going to be very difficult to understand why we sometimes recruit internationals and why we sometimes don't. And why can't those specific competencies, if there are specific competencies, and no doubt there are for international positions, why can't those be made explicit and then built into development pathways to support local and national talent to be able to create those competencies and then integrate those positions? And all that comes into one basic question, that is, how can we drive localization in humanitarian staffing? So some of the recommendations that came out of the conference at the end of the study, I've talked briefly about this one, and it's a general recommendation around localization issues, and that is challenging this problem of aversion to risk. The system is very conservative and reluctant to work with different models which incur risk. And yet the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an enormous opportunity where we've had to work with different models, where we've had to have less international presence and more local leadership. And maybe we need to use this as an opportunity to reduce our aversion to risk. Another recommendation is to focus not on status or administrative titles when we think about recruitment and staffing, but to focus on competencies and the role. So, and this is where we need to promote competency-based approaches to human resources management, as opposed to status and administrative based approaches. And we need to think about how useful labels such as national and international are, as opposed to understanding exactly what the competencies that are needed for each role. So a focus on competencies, integrate competency-based approaches into human resources practices. Value local expertise. International organizations need to place higher value on contextual knowledge and the skills to operate effectively in diverse contexts. So this can be made explicit in recruitment and remuneration, and also local staff who understand the importance of such expertise should be involved in the recruitment of new staff. And finally, use competencies to be transparent about the need for international roles. So it's really important that for every role, the competencies required should be formalized and made public, and that there should be accountability around why you can't find them locally in order to justify going to find them somewhere else. And at the same time, when those competencies can't be sourced locally, organizations should be investing in supporting local staff to develop those missing competencies for the future. And finally, international staff recruitment should always be viewed as a temporary option until those competencies can be developed amongst other staff. And the roles of international staff should be weighted towards not so much direct delivery, but more towards enabling others to carry out those tasks by supporting them to develop those skills and competencies. And so if you want to read all of the report or just the section of the report on recruitment, this is the link where you can find the report in English and French. thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.